What we need to see is arrests of some of the boards of these massive banks that have been committing fraud, like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. And we also need to see a government stepping in, the US Treasury stepping in, to stop the financial situation getting any worse. But it seems they're scared of this elite cult which is running Wall Street right now. And so, you know, I think this is not going to just go away as the elite want it to, and as the media seem to want it to.
Right, Mr. Gosling, I just want to bring a slightly bigger picture, and just briefly, Obama is facing re-election, of course, next year. The campaign is already on. How do you think these protests will affect that?
Well, Tessa, it's difficult to say at this stage because a year is a long time. Well, a week is a long time in politics. That's a long, long time in the future. But certainly Obama seems to have completely failed to inspire not just the US people, but the world. It seems he's more like a kind of glove puppet for the elite of Wall Street. And let's not forget the private military companies and the military-industrial complex in the US. This is all becoming one kind of organisation, a kind of shadow government. And actually Obama is not really a player in this kind of thing. So I think possibly it will be almost irrelevant who gets in as the next president, unless it's someone who's prepared to deal with this financial elite.
All right, thanks very much for your thoughts there. Investigative journalist Tony Gosling talking to us live.
Right, okay, the first thing to say is the media, the mass media, is like the nervous system, the brain of the organisation of humanity, right? So whoever controls that nervous system, controls what all the limbs do, the fingers, the thumbs, and the arms and the legs. And in order for the whole body of humanity to function correctly, we need to actually have that acting in our interest rather than being owned by somebody else. I mean, people sometimes just don't think about is that the journalists, the writers, the producers, the script writers, the researchers that actually produce the content don't own the transmitters, they don't own the printing presses, they don't own the whole process of who gets appointed to those jobs. That's a completely separate thing. And so many of our media owners, and we've only got 5 of the really big media companies in the world, those people have got political agendas nowadays quite often. When someone buys a newspaper, like say for example the Daily Telegraph, then they have a political agenda. They want to use that Telegraph to put out. So you've got a really difficult situation also with cross-media ownership, which is like Rupert Murdoch has been you know, a really horrendous pioneer in this, which is using a TV channel to plug a radio station, to plug a magazine, to plug book publishing. I mean, you think about Collins, HarperCollins is owned by Rupert Murdoch. This is, you know, a lot of these old style publishing houses are now controlled by him. And so the content, if you think about the Times and Rupert Murdoch's newspaper empire, in the run-up to the Afghanistan war and Iraq war, every single one of those outlets was 100% behind the war. So think about how that transposes into the publishing empire, the book publishing. It means that you've got a slant through the whole organisation in one specific particular direction. You can't blame this on the writers or the journalists, you know, in the book world, or the journalists in the news world. It's the fault of the owners, because they basically just hire the people that tell them what they want to hear. So you've got a serious problem in a lack of plurality. Another big influence in the media is advertising. So this is TV people, newspaper people providing news stories and programs that are going to appeal to specific types of advertisers. Now the advertisers want to aim the program. I mean, the program is like a conveyor belt for the adverts. As the media becomes very, you know, it's not so easy to make money doing a TV channel as it used to be 20 years ago. So they are desperate to provide television programs which will be a perfect conveyor belt for the advertisers who want to reach the high spenders. They don't care about anything else to do with the viewers, the advertisers, except that they want to reach people who've got a lot of money to spend. And Grand Designs, or More 4 on Channel 4, is a perfect example of this. I mean, most people, it's a totally aspirational program. It's like Dallas. You watch it, but you're never going to have the money to actually build and design your own country house, you know. The idea is to focus people on this aspirational, oh, maybe one day I can be like that. But actually the fact is, I mean, many people, for example, who are in rented accommodation, They never actually do any kind of even DIY, because that's the job of somebody else, and the place falls into disrepair as a result. But the whole point of this is to get to those, and where does it crowds out the kind of content that poor people will want to hear through that advertising. And also, if you do an article like, for example, Michael Meacher did, not long after, around about 2003, around about the time of the Iraq War, was an article called "This War on Terror is Bogus." Now, the next day, I spoke to someone who worked in the advertising department of The Guardian. They had nearly £1 million worth of annual advertising spend pulled from The Guardian because of this article, which was in the paper the day before. Now, as a newspaper editor working at somewhere like The Guardian, Alan Rushbridge has got a lot of difficult decisions to make about what articles he allows into his newspaper if an already indebted company is going to have to face £1 million less income that year. So the advertisers have a lot of clout. You think of all the oil company adverts, the British Airways adverts, these kinds of things which are in these papers. It means that these big corporations are steering the editorial line in a lot of our newspapers. Another thing is the separation between the printers and the journalists now. In the old days, there used to be a very close relationship. Journalists would hand stories directly to the printers. The printers would make on a form, would then show the story in metal, reverse metal, to the journalist. The journalist would sign off the story, and that was it. No one else got involved. Nowadays, the journalists press a button about 7 o'clock in the evening, and that then goes off. Now, whether the article appears the same in the next day's newspaper, you have to just cross your fingers and hope, because there's a whole process now whereby editors and sub-editors may actually change the sense of what is in that story before it actually reaches the newspaper. In a way, the introduction of new technology by Murdoch and Wapping is a step back, because it means that the deadlines for submission of copy by journalists in newspapers now are actually much earlier in the evening than they used to be in the old days. In the old days of hot metal and the old-fashioned type. And I think if somebody now got hold of a big old printing machine from the old days, a hot metal system with linotype, they may actually be able to produce a daily newspaper in this country that would have far later deadlines and more news, which is only on the internet, not in the newspapers the next day, than anyone else, because this new technology, to a large extent, has actually slowed down the translation of stories into newsprint and into newspapers. Slowed the whole process down. So there's a little, The other thing definitely to plug is the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom, because there's very few people in the world doing work on who owns our media. The campaign for press and broadcasting freedom have got regular articles in their two monthly newsletter about who is owning our press. Also following some of the big inside press stories, like, for example, like the phone hacking story. They will have stuff that's going on in the background in phone hacking, because of course this goes to the heart of the Murdoch empire, this phone hacking story, and I think ultimately we're going to see that Rupert Murdoch has been running some kind of private intelligence operation aimed at destroying political parties in Britain. I mean, look what's happened with Andy Coulson and Tommy Sheridan up in Scotland. The destruction of the most popular political leader. Tommy Sheridan had a 50% popularity support when he was taken out by Andy Coulson, who we now know, at least allegedly, is a criminal mastermind of the News of the World, was the man that's evidence at Tommy Sheridan's perjury trial sent him down. So Murdoch and his empire seem to be running basically a kind of sting operation against political opponents of the establishment in Britain. So I think ultimately that phone hacking story is going to bring down the whole Murdoch empire in Britain, certainly, if not elsewhere. But remember, the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom are one of the only campaigns in the country that actually keep a check on this stuff. And it's only something like 10 quid a year to subscribe to their newsletter. And also, it gives you a little bit of insight into stories that the journalists are talking about as journalist stories about their profession, rather than just about the stuff that they talk about at the outside world. And it gives you an insight into why so much of what we see today is skewed in favour of the establishment and the status quo, when actually the status quo, I'm afraid, is a cul-de-sac. It cannot carry on the way it is, and it seems that the political elite and the media elite are in denial about whether the financial crisis is going to just be a little hiccup or whether it's actually going to be a total disaster. The last thing they want to do is admit that it's a disaster. They've got so much invested in the system the way it is. So they're in denial about what the real solutions are, which are things like drastic measures, like serious intervention to stop a totally failing market situation in finance. So it's not just the financial system, it's also wars and things like that. That we're seeing a very, very skewed version of the media. And of course, a lot of the young people just simply don't watch television news anymore. They're getting all their information off the internet and on their mobile phones and things like that because they don't trust what we're being told by a traditional mainstream press.
It's going to crash and it's going to fall pretty hard because markets are ruled right now by fear. Investors and the big money, the smart money, I'm talking about the big funds, the hedge funds, the institutions, they don't buy this rescue plan. They basically, they know the market is toast. They know the stock market is finished. The euro, as far as they're concerned, they don't really care. They're moving their money away to safer assets, like treasury bonds, 30-year bonds, and the US dollar. So it's not going to work.
We keep hearing that whatever the politicians are suggesting, and admittedly it's all been rather woolly so far, isn't right. Can you pin down exactly what would keep investors happy, make them feel more confident?
That's a tough one. Personally, it doesn't matter. See, I'm a trader. I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I go with what if I see an opportunity to make money, I go with that. So for most traders, it's not about, we don't really care that much how they're going to fix the economy, how they're going to fix the whole situation. Our job is to make money from it. And personally, I've been dreaming of this moment for 3 years. I have a confession, which is I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. I dream of another moment like this. Why? Because people don't seem to maybe remember, but the 30s depression, the depression in the 30s, wasn't just about a market crash. There were some people who were prepared to make money from that crash. And I think anybody can do that. It isn't just for some people in the elite. Anybody can actually make money. It's an opportunity. When the market crashes, when the euro and the big stock markets crash, if you know what to do, if you have the right plan to set up, you can make a lot of money from this. For example, hedging strategies is one. Then investing in bonds, treasury bonds, that sort of stuff.
If you could see the people around me, jaws have collectively dropped at what you've just said. I mean, we appreciate your candour, however, it doesn't help the rest of us, does it, or the rest of the Eurozone? I would
say this, listen, I would say this to everybody who's watching this. This economic crisis is like a cancer. If you just wait and wait thinking this is going to go away, just like a cancer, it's going to grow and it's going to be too late. What I would say to everybody is get prepared. This is not a time right now to wishful thinking the government is going to sort things out. The governments don't rule the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world. Goldman Sachs does not care about this rescue package, neither does the big funds. So actually, what I would actually tell people, I want to help people. People can make money from this. It isn't just traders. What they need to do is learn about how to make money from a downward market. The first thing people should do is protect their assets, protect what they have. Because in less than 12 months, my prediction is the savings of millions of people is going to vanish. And this is just the beginning. So I would say be prepared and act now. The biggest risk people can take right now is not acting.
Do yourself a little bio in then.
Hello, my name is Martin Summers. I'm currently an independent journalist based in Bristol, but in the past I've worked as an aid worker and an economic advisor in Eastern Europe. I published this book in 1998 with a colleague of mine, Hungarian colleague Laszlo Andor. It's called Market Failure, Eastern Europe's Economic Miracle. And basically it's a critique of what went on in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, the privatisation, deregulation, marketisation of the former communist bloc. Lots of mistakes were made, and the book is about the mistakes that were made. And I used to work for the New Economics Foundation and Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, and I'm currently, as I say, an independent journalist.
Did you mention that you did economics at Oxford University?
I studied politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford University from 1977 to 1980. So that's a brief biography of me.
Great. Obviously, as most people are aware, we've got a massive global recession or depression or financial situation going on currently. What is your take on that, and what is your as an
Well,
PPE?
I think that since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, we've been living in a kind of in-between world where the economy is not recovering, but it hasn't completely collapsed. But I think we're at that phase is now ending because in 2008, basically the bad debts of the zombie banks were taken over by the governments of the world. Now the governments of the world have run out of money, and the zombie banks are demanding that the society as a whole carries on paying for the crisis that they created. But the real crash is about to happen. We didn't have a proper crash in 2008 because the government intervened. The government is now powerless, and the real crash will happen, and it'll be a bigger crash as a result of the government intervention. Free market economists, some of them consistently argue that the banks shouldn't have been rescued. I'm thinking now of the Von Mises Institute and the right-wing think tanks, some honest right-wing think tanks are at least consistent in saying we shouldn't rescue the banks. I think that was wrong, because if you don't rescue the banks, you get a chaotic situation. And you don't necessarily just sort things out. It just creates chaos, civil disorder, potential political conflict, and therefore the government, in a sense, will have no choice but to rescue the banking system. But having rescued the banking system, the government should have told the banks what to do. It was rather the other way. The banks, basically, having been rescued, then told the government what to do, and they still are. And the problem is that what the banks and the markets, so-called, are telling the governments to do is to cut back on public expenditure, get rid of social security and so on and so forth. But the markets themselves recognise that will not allow the debts to be repaid. So this Greek bailout that everybody's arguing about, I could see some merit in bailing Greece out if you were to give them money, like the Marshall Plan in the 1950s and 1940s and 1950s, where you say, right, we're going to give you some money to bail you out, but we don't want you to cut back. We want you to spend so that your economy will recover. But if you lend people money and then say what we want you to do is cut back, then there's no hope that they will ever repay their debts. And so the markets are like a schizophrenic, that they want their money back. They insist that the governments carry out austerity measures in order to get the money back, but the very austerity measures they're carrying out actually mean that the debts won't be repaid. The Greek deficit is increasing, not decreasing. And that's what will happen in Britain, it's what's happened in Ireland, it's what's happened all over the world. And this is why we've come to this crisis point, because the medicine that's being suggested is actually making the disease worse, and is probably as bad as the disease. And at that point, everybody has a freak out, and there's a potential for a market meltdown, as everybody realises that nobody's got any solutions, or there are no conventional solutions. I wouldn't say there are no solutions, but there are no conventional solutions within the existing setup. That's the basic problem. I mean, basically, private banking died in the Lehman Brothers crisis. It's dead, but it won't lie down. And the powers that be cannot accept that private banking is probably finished forever. They've been talking in terms of basically, ultimately, the nationalised banks and the other banks that have got implicit guarantees from the taxpayer will ultimately come back into health, will carry on being private institutions, etc., etc. Even Ed Balls at the Labour Party conference last week was saying when we sell the nationalised banks, we will use the money that we get to pay down the deficit. And I just thought that's just crazy, because the banks are bust. Nobody wants to buy something that's bust. But they're all talking as if there is going to be some sell-off of these banks at some point. And I just can't see it, because they're bust. Who wants to buy something that's bust? Unless you're going to buy it for nothing.
Totally. How do you see the rest of the world following in terms of...
Well, the Chinese economy is now starting to falter because we're their major customers. So if the Western world starts going into a downward spiral, that drags China down into a downward spiral as well. Nobody escapes. I mean, a lot of the debate about this is this will lead to the rise of China and the fall of America, and they see it as a kind of relative game, zero-sum game between different kind of economies. But the fact of the matter is that the world economy is one integrated unit now, far more so than it's ever been before. So if the Western world goes down the tubes, everybody else goes down with us, and probably faster and harder, because they're already more fragile in many respects. You know, they've already got massive unemployment problems in countries like India and China. You know, and that's while their economies are growing at full belt. And once they start faltering, they're going to be having huge problems. And I think it's because the austerity measures that are being pushed will crash the economy. You know, it's not even an if. I mean, I think the IMF was saying something like there's a 17% chance that we'll go back into recession, and I think that's ridiculous. There's a 100% chance that we're going into depression, because the policies being pursued will guarantee that. If the policies being pursued were more flexible, you might be able to kick the can down the road another time.
Do you just want to elaborate on that from an economic point of view? So obviously printing of money.
Well, I mean, they're printing money, but there's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? In Britain, we are cutting back public expenditure, which is real money, and the economy's starting to falter, so Osborne's now talking about printing funny money. And I just feel like saying, well, stop the cuts and you won't have to print the funny money, will you? Now, the problem is that there's no easy solution within the existing setup. Ultimately, what's happened is that because free market capitalism has been run as a racket, a lot of money has been concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. And that money is the money that should be being used at the moment to carry out a classic Keynesian reflationary policy. The classic Keynesian reflationary policy is when you're going into a depression or recession, the government steps up to the plate, uses its purchasing power and its borrowing power and its resources to reboot the economy. It's like your computer's crashed, you reboot it, and the government comes in and reboots the whole thing. That's what happened in the 30s and the 40s. The Second World War created a huge kind of push to the economy, and then they carried on with the same policies after the war. Because quite logically, they could, if we can do this in a war, we can do it in peacetime. And they did. And it led to a whole generation of economic prosperity. Capitalism works quite well as long as you've got a strong government intervening to make it work well. But if the government starts to pull out of this system and allows capitalism to just do its own thing, which is what we used to do before the Second World War, then these are the kind of problems that emerge. And then, when you've allowed capitalism to do its own thing, as it were, and then the state steps in and bails out the capitalists, that's what they've done. I mean, everybody else, you know, if you were running a car industry or a pizza stand, if you're bankrupt, you bust, and you just have to liquidate the company. But a bank is too big to fail, so we have to bail them out. So what effectively happens is that all the profits that have been made on the way up in the bubble have been taken by private interests, and then all the losses are dumped on everybody else when it all crashes. Now, the economy can't work like that. The economy depends upon effective demand. People have to have money in their pockets to buy stuff. Henry Ford understood that years ago. I mean, his strategy was that every worker on his production line should be earning enough money to buy one of the cars they were making. Yeah? I mean, it's called in the literature the Fordist era, but the idea was that basically high wages are good, because it means you've got people who can buy the stuff they're producing. And that's for a whole generation, the economy was run on that principle. But then in the 1980s, with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, we reverted back to much more primitive view of how the economy worked, and it's taken a generation since then for the problems to emerge, but they have emerged with a vengeance. So we've effectively got what is a rather dumb 19th century policy, and we're in the 21st century. We need a 21st century policy that builds on the good stuff that went on in the 20th century, not to go back to the 19th century. And we're not just going back to the 19th century, of course, because the crash now is going to be much bigger. Crashes in the 19th century happened quite frequently, every 3 or 4 or 5 years, 8 years. And there were quick booms and quick crashes. And the economy wasn't that integrated, so you might have a depression in Birmingham because there was a war going on, or the war had finished usually. You get a depression in Birmingham because they'd be supplying all the bullets and stuff, and the war had finished, and there'd be a quick crash. But that wouldn't affect somebody who was producing something else. Yeah? But we've now got an integrated financial system, so the crash, instead of having lots of little crashes, you have a huge bubble and one big almighty crash. This is what has to be the fear in this situation, because everything is connected to everything else and instantaneously. That if they all have a collective panic, which is quite likely, then everything will go down the tubes. It's super fast, just like that. It'll all happen in an afternoon.
What are some of the basic economic indicators which lead you to that opinion?
Well, unemployment is a fundamental one, because if you don't get unemployment down, then there's no demand, people can't buy stuff, wages are depressed. And look at the share, the stock markets and the banks. The banks basically are bust. What they've been allowed to carry on functioning, and this includes the banks that claim they didn't take any money, like Barclays. They're all of a system, yeah. So if enough banks go down, they pull other banks down with them, because they're all holding each other's stuff. Yeah, it's a system, an integrated system. So once the panic starts, it'll be like dominoes going down or a house of cards going down. And they've been allowed to carry on operating these banks because the powers that be have been bamboozled into letting them pretend that they are solvent when they're not. They're insolvent. And in the 30s, a lot of banks were not insolvent, they were just illiquid. That's to say, with a bit of extra money, they can probably carry on. But the banking system now is insolvent. If you look at the CDOs that they're holding are worth at best 30% of their face value, but they're being allowed to mark them on their books at 100%. And some people are suggesting that they're not even worth 30% of their face value, they're worth nothing. So in other words, the banks are claiming that they've got an asset base that they haven't got. And the regulators and the politicians are looking the other way, because if they do insist that the banks are honest about what their situation is, they're bust. And they can't allow them to go bust because we've got to have private banks, haven't we? So we've got to carry on throwing good money after bad to keep them in the style to which they become accustomed. What should have happened is when Obama was elected a few years ago, he should have kicked all this into shape and basically bankrupted a lot of them. A lot of people, James Galbraith is arguing this in the US, who's the son of J.K. Galbraith, the famous US economist. He's saying, well, a lot of people should go to prison. In the 1930s, lots of top bankers were sent to prison. In the 1980s, when the savings and loans scandal erupted, because we've had mini crashes like this for years, 3,000 top executives of the banks went to prison.
How long has this crash been growing then? I mean, we talk about previous.
Well, it depends. You've got different little cycles, haven't you? But this is a very long run thing that's been building up. So it's at least a generation. Yeah, my lifetime, and I'm 51. And big cycles like this. I think they call a 50-year cycle. Is sometimes called a Kondratiev cycle after the Russian economist Kondratiev. And we're at the end of a big cycle here. And you see, the modern credit system allows you to carry on pretending that you're not bust for a lot longer than it used to. In the 19th century, if you didn't get your money in from your order, if you were running a little company, you just went bust straight away. Whereas now, you can borrow to keep going, and people do. And so you can carry on for longer. The friction in the system is good, it runs on casters now. But that just means that you're building up further and further debt. Yeah? And ultimately that debt either is paid or repudiated. And that's the point we've reached. And there is no way that these debts can be repaid. So they've basically got to be liquidated. But the bondholders, that's basically the wealthy classes, are saying, no, we're not taking any losses on our portfolios. You must give us the money, we're inside. And this is completely against even free market theory. Basically, if you're bust, you're bust. Yeah? If you take a risk, you earn profit as a result of taking a risk, that's the reward for taking a risk, but if you lose, you lose. But what's happened is that basically, and this was always predictable, powerful forces always insist that they mustn't lose. And it's a straight issue now. Are the ordinary people going to pay, or are the powerful, wealthy, financial oligarchy going to pay? Is us or them? And it's simply got to be them. Just from a rational point of view, they cannot restart the economy. They don't know how to. They're incapable of doing it. The only way to do it is to invest in all sorts of new technologies and retraining and all the rest of it. We need resources to do that. Where are those resources? They've got them. They've been privately appropriated through basically trickery, and we've got to get that money back. Not print funny money, get the real money back. Yeah? Take the money off the big boys, the Warren Buffetts, the George Soroses and so on, the real money, and use that to reboot the economy, because they won't do it. No private investor is going to invest in the market at the moment. You see, the banks are being encouraged to lend to small businesses. But if I was running a retail section of a major bank, I would say, well, what's the point of lending to small businesses if the economy is just about to go down the tubes? It's stupid. And everybody thinks that there's a supply side solution to this, that if we just get more small businesses going, that will solve the problem. No, it won't, because there's no demand in the economy. Who's going to buy the stuff? Yeah? You've got to get the demand equation right. People have got to have money in their pockets to buy stuff. And the system has now been rigged to siphon money into a small elite, and they can't spend it. All they can do is put it back into more speculative games. Because they can't, there's a limit to how much money you can spend in a year. You can only eat so many donuts, you can only buy so many yachts. That's why having high wages for your workers was always a good strategy, because they will spend the money. In Japan, one of the problems they've had is that because they haven't got a welfare system like we've got in Britain, people save for their retirement, and therefore they never spend the money. Whereas in Britain, if people used to have a fair prospect of having, they didn't have to worry about being ill because of the National Health Service. Retirement was basically, should have been looked after, it's been eroded away. Well, then people can spend their wages, can't they? They don't have to save. And that means that the economy runs along a bit faster. Yeah? Keynes, the British economist John Maynard Keynes, pointed all this out 50 years ago. I'm not saying that Keynes is directly applicable in our new circumstances, because there are different features. I mean, countries used to be relatively autonomous in those days. They could follow their own policy, whatever anybody else did, and it's now not possible to do that. If you get any solution now has to have everybody buying into it. Individual countries do have room for manoeuvre, a lot more than people suggest, but ultimately it's got to be the system as a whole has to be reformed. And the key place to reform is the United States of America. If Obama had a more kind of proactive attitude to disciplining Wall Street, we might have survived this period and come out the other side with some chance of going somewhere. But Obama basically was put in power by the Wall Street people paid for his campaign. Tim Geithner, for example, is ex-Goldman Sachs. He's his Treasury Secretary or whatever it is. I mean, Obama has just not shown any willingness to take Wall Street on. Roosevelt, in the 30s, famously said, Wall Street will hate me, and I welcome their hate. Yeah? That's what I'm there for, to kick them about. And that's what the political system should have done. And in the 30s, that was managed. But these people are much more powerful now than they were then, and they've been able to basically make Obama do what they want rather than him making them do what he wants.
5th of October today, 2011. How do you see the next 6 to 12 months panning out?
I think that the crisis will come to a head sooner rather than later in the next 6 to 12 months. I think what's happened with Greece has made that absolutely clear. It's the markets themselves are very well aware that austerity in Greece will not reduce the budget deficit, will not allow the Greeks to pay their way, and therefore there will be a default. They're all scared of a default because a default by a small country like Greece is sufficient to bring down the entire banking system. And that just shows how fragile it is. I mean, Greece is like a relatively minor place, but if they don't pay their debts according to the schedule of the creditors, then the whole banking system's up for grabs and probably will collapse. This is the kind of thing that might have happened in 2008 if the government hadn't stepped in, and might have happened in 2001 after the dot-com bubble if the Federal Reserve had not started expanding the money supply as a result of 9/11. So what we've done is we've been printing funny money for nearly a decade to put off the dreadful day. But the dreadful day comes. It's like the people know that you get a credit card and you get another credit card to pay that credit card, and eventually you run out of credit cards and you've got a huge debt. Instead of one credit card, you've got 5, all of which are maxed out. We've reached that point. And at that point, the debts won't be paid. As Keynes pointed out in the 30s, debts that can't be paid won't be paid. And that's not a political posture, it's just a logical fact. And anybody who looks at the facts will realise that this debt's not going to be paid, and therefore that there's going to be a crash. I can't see any other possibility. And people haven't had a crash like this since 1929, and I think this is going to be worse than 1929 in many respects.
So what could we expect to see?
Well, first of all, we're going to see the collapse of the banking system, which will push unemployment. That will knock over into the main economy. Unemployment will rise. What's really potentially worrying is all of this printing of funny money will ultimately lead to hyperinflation and a depression, which is like the collapse of the Soviet Union, where people are losing their jobs, their salaries aren't being paid, and prices are going up 1,000% a year. Particularly in the US, there was a danger of hyperinflation because they've got so massive overhanging dollars in other countries. And if the dollar collapses, everybody sells dollars, then all those dollars rush back to the United States and force up prices inside the United States. So in the Depression, people were poor, but it was a stable stagnation. There was unemployment, which wasn't shifting, but not going anywhere, but the situation was stably miserable. This will be much more chaotic and therefore potentially more dangerous. So in Germany in the 20s and the 30s, you had hyperinflation followed by deflation. We're now going to get deflation, smash the production structure. See, once you smash the production structure, inflation then becomes endemic, because every time you try to expand demand, you get bottlenecks, which force prices up. So you then get a situation where we end up with massive inflation plus nobody in jobs. And that's pretty bad, because if you're on unemployment benefit, for example, the value of your unemployment benefit will evaporate. And you will basically, you might as well, I mean, some countries haven't even got unemployment benefit, like South Africa. And there was already 40% unemployment, and that's during the boom. In the crash, it could go up to 60%. And you can see the social consequences of that can be quite disastrous in terms of social violence, criminal behaviour, the black market, the drugs economy, gang culture. You know, it's not a pretty prospect, is it? But I'm afraid it takes big crises like this to make people face reality. Basically, capitalism is over in its traditional form. There are solutions, but they're not capitalist solutions, and therefore at the moment they're off the radar. We can't discuss them apart from at the margin. And once the crash has happened, the main free market ideology really will be discredited, and there may be an opportunity then to do the necessary things. But it's going to be a bumpy ride, very bumpy ride.
What would you suggest would be some solutions out of
the obvious
situation?
solutions is to actually invest in the future, in new technologies, in retraining people. But frankly, it's better to have people doing something rather than nothing. Yeah? I mean, you can send them out to do all the things that we need. We need a list of things we want doing. We need. One of my personal things that I'd like to see is a whole new generation of nursing schools, properly staffed, so that every kid in a country like Britain gets a really good chance of a start in life. Why don't we just build them and staff them? We say we can't afford it. I say we can't afford not to. We need to think in terms of what we want to do and then work backwards to how we do it, rather than saying we can't afford this and we can't afford that. That's silly, basically. But we've got to, people in general will not start to think in these terms until the crisis has really bitten. So what's happened in the last 4 years is we've been in an intervening period where the government has intervened to prop up the private system, but they've not done anything to reform it. And now we've got to actually not just reform it, it's past that. We've got to get rid of it and do something else, basically.
Can you speak a little bit more on why this is going to be a worse depression than the 29?
Because in 1929 the financial markets were much less sophisticated and much less big than they are now. I mean, the shadow banking market, which has grown up in the last 15 to 20 years, is by several orders of magnitude bigger than the gross product of the world's economies. Some people think it's 20 times bigger, some people think it's 50 times bigger, some people think it's more than that. Now, in 1929, the bubble was much smaller than that. Yeah. So the consequences of the crash will be really big, because it's all interlinked now in a way that it wasn't in 1929. Yeah, it was the mechanism for spreading the depression was through trade and things of that sort. The mechanism for spreading depressions now, it's like SARS or bird flu or whatever. It's just going to go through, or Ebola virus. Yeah, we're just much more vulnerable to a crash now than we were then. For example, less people are involved in subsistence agriculture than we were in the 20s and 30s. Subsistence agriculture allows people to survive these kind of crashes, but that's basically been rendered unviable by various tricks, basically, around the world. So the potential for a catastrophic meltdown is there. You see, and then the social consequences follow. You think about the 30s, the rise of Hitler, the rise of the militarists in Japan, the war in China in the third. Gradually, we're already at the stage where wars are raging. and they're just going to, it's like the crash will be like throwing methylated spirits on the barbecue.